Welcome to the Ultimate Depression Survival Kit, How to Overcome and Master Depression with me, Dr. Moses Simuyemba. Today is day 9 and our topic is the Great Depression Black Hole and how to avoid it. What is this black hole? Well, I call it the black hole because a lot of you might be familiar with black hole in terms of astronomy. And in terms of astronomy, a black hole is a region of space-time exhibiting gravitational acceleration so strong that nothing, no particle, or even electromagnetic radiation such as light can escape it. And so it sucks in everything around it. That is the astronomical definition of a black hole. I call this black hole of depression as such because when you are in this black hole, it sucks all your energy, it sucks all your drive, it sucks all your self-esteem. It leaves you trapped in your own thoughts and it sucks everything till it leaves you with nothing. That is why it is very important to know what this black hole is and how to deal with it, because this is how devastating it can be. What is the black hole, you ask? It is isolation, and that can be social or emotional isolation. Let us look at each one of these in more detail. Social isolation is the absence of social relationships, and therefore means one has no one to interact with, to socialize with, to talk to, and so on. So there are three things that we need to be aware of as far as social isolation goes. One is solitude. Now, solitude is the state of being alone, and solitude can be chosen or forced. It can be healthy and unhealthy. For instance, a prisoner is forced into solitude because they are in prison. They might be forced into solitary confinement, as we call it. And sometimes there's good solitude, like, if you're an introvert like me, you like being alone sometimes, and you find being alone refreshing, where you can think and read or do things alone. So solitude in itself is not a bad thing. It can be healthy or unhealthy. Isolation, however, is different. It is a lack of social relationships or emotional support, and that is never a good thing, like solitude, which can be bad or good. Isolation is always detrimental because it means you lack contact with people, and even when you are in contact with people, sometimes it can be emotional isolation where you don't feel connected to other people for whatever reason. Loneliness is a craving for social contact, and it is often linked to feelings of sadness and emptiness. So these definitions are very important as far as understanding social isolation. Emotional isolation is an inability or unwillingness to share emotions with others. So it leads to superficial conversations where you don't want to really share how you feel about what you're going through, your situation, or anything. And it can also be a feeling of being numb emotionally, where you don't feel like you're experiencing anything emotionally. Things just don't touch you, just don't affect you on an emotional level. That can be part of emotional isolation. It can also be feeling shut down. Sometimes you just feel shut down. You feel like you can't respond to things the way you're supposed to emotionally. You can't talk to somebody emotionally. You can't let yourself be emotionally involved with somebody in a relationship. So there can also be that feeling of being shut down as a form of emotional isolation. One can feel emotionally isolated even with a good social network. It is possible to have contact with a lot of people, be amongst many people, be even in a marriage or in a relationship, and still feel emotionally isolated, maybe because of things that are happening in that relationship or the dynamics of that relationship, whatever the case might be. It can also just be because of your depression that you feel emotionally isolated, and that can be a big factor in terms of feeling emotionally isolated, the depression itself. It can be a defense mechanism from distress. So you realize that when you're going through difficult situations or relationship issues where you might be arguing with your partner or dealing with difficult things with your partner or in a marriage, sometimes it's a defense to emotionally shut down so that you're not affected by what your partner or the other person does. And therefore you shut yourself off emotionally as a defense mechanism where you just stop caring anymore. It can occur in intimate relationship, and I've already given those examples. For instance, infidelity, cheating, abuse, and trust issues can lead to emotional isolation, where you don't feel like you can open up to a person because they've betrayed you in one way or another, or that you've opened up in the past and you felt judged by them, you felt misunderstood by them, and therefore because of that you shut yourself off emotionally. So a lot of things that can lead to that emotional shutdown, emotional isolation. And these are just examples, and I know a lot of you might have experienced these at one time or another. However, there can be healthy time alone, and I covered this a little bit. So let's not confuse emotional isolation or social isolation with healthy time alone. Healthy time alone, depending on your personality, can be a good thing. For introverts, as I mentioned, time alone is important to recharge, to energize, whereas for extroverts, time with other people is how they recharge, partying and all that kind of thing. Time alone can help you focus on your needs, your goals, or your feelings, and it can be rejuvenating. However, you need to distinguish that from isolation, which we have covered in the previous slides. So how would you know if you or somebody is going through social isolation? Here is some guidelines, though not an exhaustive list, but you get this sense. You will be going through social isolation if you avoid social interaction due to shame or depression. So if you feel like you are depressed and therefore you might be a letdown to other people, or might be a damp on the mood, and so on, then you might isolate yourself and avoid interaction. If you spend extended periods of time alone, beyond what is healthy in terms of seeking solitude or just time alone, but if you spend extended periods of time alone, if you experience social anxiety or fears of abandonment at the idea of social interaction, so some people just fear being with other people, interacting with other people, and therefore isolate themselves. If you have only limited or superficial social contact, so no close relationship, no close friends, no intimate relationships, and so on, you're probably experiencing social isolation. Or if you stay away from your family members, siblings, and so on, that is a sign that you may be isolating yourself socially. If you lack important social or professional relationships, it's another sign that you may be isolating yourself socially. And if you develop severe distress and loneliness, then definitely you know that you are isolating yourself. If you have this longing to be with other people, but somehow for whatever reason you cannot be with other people, then definitely you are experiencing social isolation. Why do people isolate themselves? Well, there are a number of reasons. And in terms of depression, these are the things to consider. When somebody is going through depression, often it's a very low point in their lives and they lack self-esteem. Their sense of worth decreases a lot. So there's sometimes this sense that no one will miss me, if I'm not around or if I'm gone. And you hear this a lot from people that are going through depression. They feel no one will miss them if they're not there, or if they die or anything like that. And the other thing that people with depression often say is, the world is better off without me. There is sometimes this deep sense of being a burden when you're depressed, like you have no use to anybody and you're not of use to yourself as well. And that may be a burden, people who may be looking after you or taking care of you, and you're not adding any value. There's sometimes that deep sense of that, and people tend to say such things as, the world is better off without me. There can also be a sense of shame when you're going through depression, because sometimes you don't understand yourself and why you're going through it. And especially sometimes you have the desire to be out of it, but you just don't know how. And so that leads to shame and the feeling that, you're not so good, or you did something to deserve where you are, and so on and so forth. There can also be a sense of rejection from people you've talked to about your depression, or things that have happened to you that may have led to your depression. For instance, childhood trauma, that can lead to a sense of feeling rejected most times. And so people will tend to isolate themselves if they feel rejected, or in social circles if they feel like they're not appreciated, or friends reject them, and so on. That can also be a big factor. It can also be about feeling misunderstood, especially sometimes when you try to open up to people about what's going on with you, and you feel like they don't understand or they don't make an effort to understand you. And so that can be very frustrating. And so rather than have contact with people, some people choose to isolate themselves and just get off that feeling of being misunderstood. It can also be about avoiding things that remind you of traumatic events. So, for instance, avoiding people that remind you of traumatic events, or people that may have done bad things to you, or people that, might have contributed to how you feel one way or another, or just places that make you feel uncomfortable, that remind you of certain events that may have happened to you. And this is very common sometimes with people that have gone through traumatic events such as sexual trauma, rape and such things, or being abused as a child. And it can take one trigger, one situation, one place that can trigger all these memories and feelings of what you went through. And so it can also be about avoiding those traumatic events. So a number of reasons why people might isolate themselves in terms of depression. Other factors that can lead to isolation in terms of depression is that you might just be tired of putting up a front and pretending all is okay. Your friends are out having a good time, partying, or events that, you're supposed to be happy and lively, and you just don't feel like pretending anymore because that's not how you feel. You feel very low, you're at a very bad point in your life. And so pretending can be a very energy consuming thing. And that leads me to the next point, which is that when you're depressed, your energy levels might be low. So you just might not have the energy to be out there with other people. And also, one of the symptoms of depression is a lack of interest in usual activities and people. So it could be one of the core issues in your depression, one of the core symptoms of your depression, that you've just lost interest in what is going on around you and in other people. And we've covered feeling like a burden on other people, feeling like people need to cheer you up and such things. And so you just feel like maybe it's better not to burden them with all that. There is the more serious thing of self-harm and suicide risk. And sometimes people isolate themselves because they have suicidal thoughts and thoughts of harming themselves. And in such cases, isolation can be very dangerous. It can be the depth of this black hole. Because if you are alone and having self-harm or suicidal thoughts, it is very likely that you act on those thoughts. And that is why isolation is so dangerous in such situations. That is why it's important to be always, or try to be not isolated, so that when people recognize that you're having these thoughts, or when you open up about these thoughts, you can get the help that is necessary. It has been found that people who isolate themselves are more likely actually to commit suicide or harm themselves physically. There can also be unintended isolation. So isolation that is unintended, in terms of somebody does not want to be isolated, but they just find themselves in situations that are isolating. For instance, elderly people who may be living alone, the whole family has moved on, or their friends have died, and so on, because they are elderly, can find themselves isolated socially with no friends, no family around. And often, sometimes, elderly people are put in old people's homes, and that can be a very isolating experience where you only get visitors at certain times. And as sad as it is, sometimes these people are dumped in such homes and never visited by anyone meaningful. The only interaction they have is with the nursing staff or the doctors that look after them, which can be a very sad thing that can contribute to depression. Adolescents sometimes, or young adults, go through a period of isolation, especially before marriage, because there's a lot happening at that time. You might find yourself busy just with certain things and school and so on, trying to make your way as an adult into adulthood. And that can be a very isolating time too. Retired people, because they've lost contact with work colleagues and so on, whom they spend a lot of time with, may find themselves isolated, because during work times, you have friends, you have colleagues at work, and you don't realize that your other social circles might be shrinking. And all of a sudden you retire and you realize, hey, the only friends I had were my work colleagues. So that can be also unintended isolation. Chronic illness can lead to isolation. You can't go out because you're chronically ill. You have to look after yourself. You have to take medication, or you might just not have the energy to go out and interact with people because you are sick. Migration can be another factor. Leaving one area to go and live in another, for instance, for work purposes, refugees in such cases, that can also be a cause of unintended isolation. Living in a remote area can be a cause of isolation. Some places are very remote. You find the next neighbor is several kilometers away. Maybe you don't even have a vehicle to go visit them regularly. No phone network in such areas. That can be a cause of isolation. And of course, prison or jail can be unintended isolation and can be very destructive to one mentally and socially. There are sex differences in terms of how men and women might encounter isolation or handle it. Men generally tend to be more isolated because, as you know, men are less likely to admit to loneliness due to cultural and social norms, and just this thing that men were not supposed to show emotion or be depressed. And therefore, men are less likely to talk about their depression and therefore can be more isolated. Childbearing can be a cause of isolation for women during pregnancy and breastfeeding. I don't understand the growing social stigma around breastfeeding, especially in public. It's something we've all gone through as children, so I don't understand why we're developing such a distaste for it. But anyway, that can be a cause of isolation for women as well as pregnancy. And there is also what is called postpartum depression, which comes on after childbearing. And so this is motherhood-related isolation that can be a major factor in depression for women. Social media as well can lead to isolation because it can lead to a lack of real contact and interaction with people. You can be spending so much time on your phone that you don't feel the need to go out and interact in real life with people. Or sometimes you can be with people and not interact with them because you're busy on your phone, which in itself is a form of isolation. Younger users are more at risk of isolation the more time they spend on social media. Actually, that takes away real life interaction with people. And often on social media, we have superficial interaction online versus the kind of deep interaction you can have with a person in person or off social media. Cyberbullying is another issue about social media that can lead to isolation. So cyberbullying online can actually have very detrimental effects in terms of contributing to depression or worsening depression. And also it has been found to actually in some cases lead to suicide and such things. So cyberbullying is another thing to consider when one looks at social media and how it can contribute to isolation. So let us look briefly now at a few studies on isolation and its link to depression. Choi et al. In 2015 published a systematic review titled The Impact of Social Isolation on Behavioral Health in the Elderly. And they looked at what they termed subjective and objective types of social isolation. So they describe subjective and objective isolation in these ways. Subjective social isolation has been characterized as a perceived shortage in one's social resources, such as companionship or social support, whereas objective social isolation has been explained as a lack of contact with others due to situational factors such as a small size of social network, infrequent social interaction, or lack of participation in social activity. So the important thing here is that in subjective social isolation, one feels that they do not have the kind of contact they would like, even though they might have people around them and the resources around them to have that contact. Whereas in objective social isolation, one really does not have those contacts or that network that they need. So they found that both subjective and objective types of social isolation increased behavioral symptoms such as sleep disturbance, depression symptoms, and fatigue in older adults. Furthermore, recent studies also reported stronger effects of subjective social isolation than objective social isolation, pointing to the fact that how you feel about your social isolation or the reasons for you being isolated may be more important than actually what the situation is in terms of affecting whether you have sleep disturbance or depression. Social isolation affects behavioral health in older adults, and compared to objective social isolation, subjective social isolation, contributes more significantly to sleep disturbance and depression. So quite interesting findings there on isolation generally. The take-home message here is that isolation contributed to feelings of depression and sleep disturbance in the elderly. Here is an alarming study by Rico Uribe et al., published in 2018. It was a systematic review of 35 other studies, and it was titled Association of Loneliness with All-Cause Mortality. They found that loneliness is a risk factor for all-cause mortality for both genders, so whether male or female, and for women and men separately. So interesting thing there, if you look at those numbers, that men were more at risk of all-cause mortality as a result of loneliness than women. What does this mean? Well, in short, it means that loneliness increases your risk of dying from any cause, according to this study. So if you're lonely, your likelihood of dying from any cause is increased, quite alarming. And this increase is more, this risk rather is more in men than in women. Quite an alarming statistic there. Not linked to depression as such, but I just wanted to show you the effects that isolation can have on you as an individual. Let's look very quickly at effects of isolation. Well, the first thing is that isolation breeds more isolation. The more isolated you are, the more likely you are to continue being isolated. Higher levels of stress hormones and inflammation can result as a consequence of isolation. Heart disease, including high blood pressure and coronary artery disease, a heightened risk of developing a disability, increased vulnerability to chronic illness such as type 2 diabetes. Social isolation may even increase one's risk of premature death. A 2015 study found social isolation increases a person's risk of death by about 30%. So again, this promotes the findings of the previous study we looked at that found that all-cause mortality is increased, or the risk of all-cause mortality is increased due to social isolation. And also it can lead to more suicidal thoughts or suicidal thoughts as well. Other effects of isolation include social anxiety, deepening depression, of course, which is our main topic. The more isolated you are, the deeper your depression is likely to become, because like I said, you are trapped in your own thoughts. You're going around in your head over and over again. No one to talk to, no one to release your emotions to, no one to open up to about what's going on with you, no one to see that you need help, and therefore it can lead to deepening depression. It can also contribute to dementia, can contribute to negative self-image and worsening self-esteem. And hiding away and no one knows what is happening to you can be very dangerous. In some extreme cases, it can lead to lack of physical care for yourself, not washing, not brushing your teeth, not combing, not shaving, those kinds of things. And it can be very bad in some cases. Another bad effect is that it can lead to alcohol and drug abuse for you to get over the feelings that you have or the feelings you're struggling with. Social isolation can lead to those. And there is a declining sense of hope and not seeing any way out. That's why I call it a black hole, because it slowly decreases your interaction with other people. Your life becomes narrower, your interest becomes narrower, and you find like your vision, is decreasing and decreasing about what's possible with your life. And that is why it's such a dangerous black hole to be in and why you need to be out of it. How to avoid social isolation? Well, the first thing is that you must open up to somebody about what you're going through if you realize that you're isolating yourself. That is the first step to breaking that isolation. Talk to somebody about it. Of course, it needs to be somebody you trust, somebody you can trust with your emotions, and somebody you think will not judge you, somebody that you know will be supportive, and so on. So you need to choose that person carefully, but you need to open up to somebody. And if you find you cannot open up to somebody in your social circles, or there is nobody because that's the reason you're isolated, seek professional help. Talk to a professional about what you're going through. So your doctor, your counselor, a psychotherapist, a psychiatrist, sometimes there's peer support groups, anybody that you think would help you to have time to talk to other people, but also interact with other people, and also be able to talk about what's going on with you. And sometimes it is a question of seeking both somebody close to you to talk to, a friend, and so on, or a spouse and so on to talk to, and professional help at the same time, because these can have different benefits to your situation and different perspectives that they can bring to you. The important thing, however, is to realize that you will not get out of this alone. You should not hide it. You should not be ashamed of it. You need to open up to somebody else and talk about what is going on with you, because that is one critical step to getting help. And you never know, this person you talk to might be the key to linking you to the services and the help that you need. They might not be able to help you themselves, but they might be able to help you seek the help you need and encourage you to do so. So very important that you open up. We'll cover in another video how to get the most from professional help, and that will also enlighten you more on the kinds of professional help you can get. So tell somebody about your challenges, open up about what you're going through to somebody. If you live alone, try to get a housemate. Sometimes that is possible. Rent out a room or something, get somebody you can interact with, or just get a housemate, a friend to live with you. Try to spend more time with family and friends. Now, that can be very difficult, of course, when you're going through depression. Try to get off social media and interact with people more in real life. Build social skills. And lastly, get a pet. You'll be surprised the therapeutic value of pets. Dogs, cats, and so on, and other pets have been found to be very beneficial to human beings and can get rid of that sense of social isolation. Of course, you can't talk to them, they can't understand you the way a human being can, but they can add some emotional benefit to your life in terms of having a companion. So getting a pet is a very powerful way to not feel isolated. Besides having a dog, for instance, you need to go out, take the dog for walks in the park and so on and so forth. That can be another way of getting to interact with people. People might see your dog and say, hey, they have a dog too, and that could be another way of meeting people. So there are various strategies you can utilize, but I know when you're going through depression, it can be very difficult to even do these things I'm telling you about. That's why the first step is always to try and open up about your situation so that you get the help you need, either from other people or from a professional, because without that initial help, it can be very hard to psych yourself up or to get the energy and reserves to get yourself out of an isolation situation. So open up to somebody, and if you have the energy, the mental reserves, do these other things that can help you to be more in contact. Join a club, play some sport, do something that will help you to be more in contact with other people. The take-home message here is stay connected. Social support is a critical part of depression recovery, and therefore you must find ways to stay socially connected. This can be through family, through friends, through colleagues at work, or through activities, clubs, neighborhood activities that go on, joining a charity. Just do something that keeps you busy and connected. Sport can also be another way to stay connected. And this can be exercising, gymming, yoga, and so on. And we cover the benefits of sport as far as dealing with depression goes and so on, other than just dealing with the isolation aspects. So sport can be a good way to stay connected and to meet people that have similar interests to you. I know where I stay, for instance, there's a lot of running groups that run several times a week. There is a lot of groups that go hiking. And these are people you don't necessarily have to know personally, but you get together once in a while, every week on a weekend, go hiking together. That is a good form also of staying socially connected. So, of course, I know some of these things are not possible for some people, but you need to look at your social network and see whether there are people you can do these things with or connect with at some level. And if you don't have such a social network, then you need to look at how you can get such a network going around you. It might need changes such as moving to a new neighborhood, finding a new job, making new friends. Those are challenging things to do, but They need to be done in order for you to live a healthy and well-balanced life. Bottom line, as far as dealing with depression, overcoming depression, and I cannot emphasize this enough, avoid physical and emotional isolation. It is the black hole as far as depression goes. It is enemy number one. A lot of your recovery depends on avoiding it. Stay connected and get the necessary help. Lastly, download the workbook for today, go through the exercises, follow the links, watch the additional resources that are provided. Take your time with it, see how this applies to your own situation. Be critical of yourself, be truthful to yourself as you go through these exercises. That is the only way you will benefit from them. Thank you very much for joining me on this day, the Great Depression black hole, and how to avoid it. I hope you have got a sense of what it is and what you can do personally to avoid it. The exercises in the workbook will help you get more to grips with it and how to go about avoiding isolation when you are depressed.